Hello, everyone. Welcome to our top 5 series for Ryerson's alumni and friends. My name is Christian Mehta, and I am the AVP of Engagement at the university. I am delighted to be here in this session. Before we begin, I want to pay respects to the Indigenous elders, peoples, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the land upon which Ryerson is located. Generations before European contact. They cared for this land, its nature, and other. At Ryerson, we've made a deep and long-lasting commitment to truth and reconciliation, and I invite you to learn more about this work online and in person next time we can get together. We know that you've got a lot on the go, so this is just a 30-minute webinar, a flavor for what's to come. And we'll dive in quickly, but before I introduce our presenter, Omar Ha-Redeye, I want to highlight a few items from the email that you would have received with the link to this webinar. In about 20 minutes, Omar will be taking your questions. If you want to ask something, please send your question to Jennifer Hicks using the chat function so she can moderate the flow. Your cameras and mics are off, so sending your questions to Jennifer directly is the best way to go. Second, after the Q&A, we'll have a short 10-second poll that we'd like for you to complete, please. This poll will help us plan future online learning opportunities for you. We're recording these webinars, so you'll receive a link in an email later on so you can watch it again and share it with your network. And finally, if you're on social media, please use hashtag #RUTop5. I would now like to introduce today's expert. Omar Ha-Redeye is a Toronto and Durham region lawyer, legal academic, and Ryerson graduate, Health Administration 2006. He's the executive director of the Durham Community Legal Clinic, which focuses on public legal education and providing legal services to low-income residents. In 2011, Omar was named one of the top 12 social media influencers practicing law in Canada. And in 2015, he was awarded the Ontario Bar Association Foundation Award for exceptional contributions to improving the justice system and public legal education. In 2017, Omar received the Ted Rogers School of Management Teaching Award for contract lecturers at Ryerson. And in the following year, he was recognized by the Canadian Law Blog Awards, the CLAWBs, for the best blogger in the group blog or platform. He holds an LLM in health law from Osgoode Hall Law School and coursework in advanced trial advocacy. He was also awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for promoting access to justice and advocacy on behalf of marginalized and discriminated populations. He's been a great friend and champion for Ryerson's new law school as well. Thank you, Omar, for all that you do for us and our communities. So it's over to you now for the next 20 minutes. Omar?
Thank you, Christian. That was a great intro, lots of stuff there. I'm really pleased and honored to be here today. It's part of my honor and privilege to be addressing the Ryerson alumni. I'm obviously a Ryerson alumni myself. And it's a very difficult time, I think, not just for Ryerson alumni, but everybody in Ontario and across Canada. So to be able to address some of these legal issues, it's not only important, but very timely. And I'm more than happy to share some information. So here's the agenda that we have here for today in terms of some key topical issues. And I'm going to start out with job safety. If you're like me, Ryerson gave me an amazing education, and an education that, more importantly, didn't just give me a job, but gave me a career. And I think that's what I consistently hear from many of our graduates and some of my former students. And so what I want to talk about in that context is, obviously, we're facing a pandemic of unprecedented proportions, of an entirely unique nature, and one which most workplaces haven't anticipated or prepared for. And so what does that mean? It means that if you're not an essential business, and so those lists have been released by the provincial government now twice, and they've been modified. If you're not an essential business, you probably are at home. That's the most likely situation. But if you are an essential business, your employer probably or may require you to work, and those might be in workplace situations where you're potentially exposed to COVID-19. And so in that context, what are the workplace safety obligations or the important considerations in that context? The most important thing to keep in mind in that context is that employees should maintain a lot of the stuff that we're hearing in terms of public health messaging. So hand washing, obviously, social distancing, even on the job, and maintaining as much as you can the type of practice in terms of cleaning equipment that's shared and things like that. But what happens if you're in a situation where you're being required to work and you're being exposed, in your opinion, unnecessarily to COVID-19 and contracting the virus? Well, there are health and safety laws that still apply in this context, and the most important thing to keep in mind is that you should bring that to the attention of your supervisor or your manager, explain to them what the concerns are, see if that can be resolved. If it cannot be resolved through that process, there are avenues for other recourse, such as to the Ministry of Labor, where you can do a work refusal and actually report that type of work. What is also very important to emphasize this in this context, because I know Ryerson has a wonderful nursing program, and we have a lot of graduates who are working right now on the front lines dealing with coronavirus in the healthcare setting, is that the union, because most nurses working in hospitals, the union and the collective agreement will often address how this is handled, in particular as it relates to PPEs, personal protective equipment. And so it's important in the unionized context to discuss that with the union and for them to manage that. In those roles, so healthcare as well as potentially law enforcement and some other areas, it may be intrinsic to your work that you're working with things like viruses and situations where it might be unhealthy or exposing you to a risk. And so the question will really then become whether or not you're using appropriate PPEs, personal protective equipment. If you do get sick, and we hope nobody does, and you have to take time off, there might be some WSIB benefits available to you, so that's something to keep in mind. WSIB has indicated that coronavirus will be a grounds potentially eligible for WSIB, but it has to be handled on a case-by-case basis. The other situation that we're dealing with here is where employers and businesses, given the fact that they're not conducting business in the way they typically have been, they're facing a financial crunch. And so we are seeing employers who are unfortunately put in a position where they are laying off employees. In some situations, those layoffs are temporary. And so that is obviously a very big concern for a number of individuals, given the fact that they have expenses like rent and groceries, and we'll talk about those issues next. But there is a concern that if you are temporarily laid off, you may not have enough money to pay for those expenses. I understand we just did a seminar on finances, so I'm not going to recap a lot of those benefits that are in place, but it is important to keep in mind that under employment law, it is challenging for employers to do a temporary layoff if that temporary layoff is not spelled out in the actual employment contract. And so obviously this is very much contingent on your particular workplace and your particular employment relationship. What I would say in this situation, if you are an employee who's been temporarily laid off, it's probably wise to look at how long that duration will be. So if it's going to be, for example, 13 weeks, because 13 weeks is a threshold that's used in the Employment Standards Act. And then if it's going beyond those 13 weeks or, and you're being rehired, you're being brought back to the job, that's probably a best case scenario. But if you're not, and you're put in a tough financial situation because that temporary layoff goes on for a longer period of time, what you may have is what's called in employment law a constructive dismissal case. So the terms of your employment relationship have been changed. There is something to keep in mind here, though. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, coronavirus is something that we have never seen in the Canadian landscape, and that includes in the legal context. And so we can expect that employers are going to argue that the employment contract has potentially been frustrated, meaning that there are circumstances that they didn't anticipate that have arisen, obviously, and that they've had to modify the employment contract in light of those changing circumstances. So it's not going to be a slam dunk in terms of the employment relationship as to whether or not you have a case there, but it is important to understand that there are some legal protections that may come into play. Along those same lines, I want to talk about terminations and human rights. I think this is one of the challenges that we're facing, is that in a pandemic or any type of emergency situation, typically the people who bear the brunt of difficulties in society are going to be the most marginalized and vulnerable members. And so that's additionally true for example, with people who are, oh, sorry, I jumped a slide there, who may not, who may experience discrimination, let's say in the workplace or in society generally. We can expect and anticipate that in a pandemic situation, we are going to see more of that, not just in the employment context, but also in the context of accessibility and treatment and receiving services in society at large. And so human rights are not suspended during a pandemic. They still apply. They're probably one of the most important considerations from a legal perspective because they have what we call quasi-constitutional standing. So they're almost like the Constitution. And so the courts are going to protect that very strongly. Human rights can also come into play in the workplace context. And so something to keep in mind in that context is that you shouldn't have individuals, for example, being terminated because of either contracting coronavirus or because they're providing care to someone who has coronavirus or potentially has had exposure to someone who has coronavirus. Those would be, especially family members, those would potentially hit up directly against potential human rights grounds, and there would be recourse for those employers that engaged in that. Along those lines, the government has done as much as they can to try to protect the people in Ontario against that type of behavior by employers, and they have passed a very specific job protected leave under the ESA, very much along those lines of human rights grounds that I've described. So it includes explicitly if an individual is in isolation or under quarantine, they cannot be terminated. Now that is a leave without pay, but the protection there is that you would have that job once you are able to come back from that isolation or quarantine. I'll also point out here briefly that the Human Rights Commission in Ontario has indicated that disability is also engaged as to how we actually handle COVID-19, including medical conditions and perceived medical conditions that may contain social stigma. So that would include situations where we have, let's say, a comorbidity or a higher susceptibility to coronavirus, or may not be able to, let's say, protect ourselves as much because we have a greater susceptibility due to disabilities or other protecting grounds under the code. I'm going to move here to rent now, and rent has become a huge issue, of course, for all the reasons that I've already described. Whether you've lost your job or whether you are on a temporary layoff, the one thing that we're expecting is that a lot of people in Ontario are going to be facing a budget crunch. And the biggest expenditures that we see on a family basis typically are going to be areas like housing and food, food being the next one that we're going to talk about. So I'll make a reference to a movement that we've seen in the GTA, and it's a movement that came out of Parkdale, and it's called Keep Your Rent movement. And so the argument was, as of April 1st, don't pay your landlords any rent, and keep the money to yourself and let the landlord bear all the brunt of that. What we're typically suggesting is that you don't do that. If you can pay the rent, the Premier has said this, if you can pay your rent, pay it. But if it's a choice between groceries and rent, obviously you want to have the amount of money to pay your groceries and be able to take care of yourself. But under the law, rent is still due, it's still owing. The only difference is that during this pandemic, it's an emergency situation. And so what we've seen is that the government has indicated and the courts have indicated that there will not be any evictions from people's homes unless there's a serious safety issue or if there's illegal activity occurring in the unit. And so we can expect that if you're not paying your rent, you're not going to get evicted, you're not going to get tossed out of your home, but eventually you're going to have to pay that rent. And so it's important to keep in mind that that relationship with the landlord is one that needs to be maintained. And the best way to do that is to have a conversation with your landlord. And that conversation might look like something along the lines of, I only have enough money to pay half my rent, even though it's the start of the month. I've applied for a certain number of benefits that the government has announced, and by the end of the month, I might be able to get the rest of that rent. Is that okay? And what I would suggest is that most landlords are also concerned. They're facing a financial crunch and they have mortgages to pay. And so what they are consistently saying is that if a tenant does approach them in that manner and has that type of conversation, then they're typically more than happy to actually work with the tenant to actually find a schedule that works. The reason why we're suggesting that type of cooperative relationship is that once the tribunals are doing evictions, what we're going to expect is that those N4 notices, which are for arrears in rent, will actually then potentially have some teeth, and you may be facing an eviction down the road. If you're living in Toronto in particular, where housing is already pretty expensive, we don't want to see individuals losing their homes, losing their apartments, and then having to try to find a new apartment in a situation where there may not be a lot of vacancies, and in fact rent might be higher because you might have been in a unit that was that had a rent control situation. So how do we deal with the situation where let's say a landlord wants to inspect the unit and come into the unit, which is also one of those issues that arises in housing law? Well, the right of a landlord, or the ability of a landlord to inspect the unit with proper notice, still applies here, with some exceptions. If you are under a mandatory quarantine, so whether and that's usually with some medical evidence or some reported symptoms, then you should not be offering your landlord entry into the unit. If you're self-isolating as a precaution, it's also not unreasonable, so it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's also not unreasonable to say that no, we don't want you to come in, especially if there's concerns about the health and safety to your family members, or related to compromised immune systems or other underlying health issues related to comorbidities. So there is, as we like to say, some common sense that does come into play in the law. Law isn't just about rights. I mean, it is very much about the rights, and that's why we're doing this seminar. But we want you to also use some common sense in terms of understanding what your rights might be, because eventually we're going to have those hearings related to COVID-19 probably sooner rather than later. So most of those have been suspended. Starting this week, the courts in Ontario have moved to a virtual or a digital courts, and so we're expecting many of the tribunals are going to follow suit with that, and we'll probably be doing some court hearings very similar to what we're doing in this Zoom meeting within the next few weeks, if not the next couple months. And so the point there is that there are implications and consequences for simply withholding your rent and not trying to find a way that you can actually negotiate that with your landlord. The last of the top topics that we have here, the top 5 topics, is if you can't afford your groceries. And this is in particular for individuals who are Ontario Works or ODSP. For those of you that are not familiar with Ontario Works and ODSP, those are government systems or government supports that are in place. There is never any, or there shouldn't be any, stigma or embarrassment about being on Ontario Works and ODSP. That's something I do need to emphasize, okay? It is a social support that is there for when people are in tough times. There is no tougher time in Ontario than what we are seeing right now. And so for those of you that are looking for some additional supports and are not on Ontario Works or ODSP right now, that is worth looking into. I can tell you that Ontario Works is taking applications either online or via the telephone, so you can go through their website and apply there. And it may in fact be a very important part of how we actually get through this as a society, is that we use those social supports as they're intended, which is to help people who are in challenging situations. Part of Ontario Works, and I'll emphasize that, is not just a matter of providing financial supports. There's also a component of it that assists individuals in terms of retraining and getting some employment. And so in the situation where our jobs are disrupted, our entire lives are disrupted, these programs may take a greater priority. Now, if you are on Ontario Works or ODSP, they do have, even independent of this emergency system, some special funds that can be advanced under emergency assistance funding. Typically, though, there is a waiting period and an application period for that type of funding. In this particular situation where we're in a pandemic and the emergency has been announced and you're already on Ontario Works or ODSP, that wait time has been waived, especially if you're able to say, look, I need the money and I can't wait 6-month period. I need that within the next 48 hours and I need to have that money. And so that emergency assistance can be found on the Ontario Works website, and they have a special page dedicated to that. There's also additional funds that are available through discretionary benefits for things like cleaning supplies or additional transportation, which might be necessary in the situation that we're dealing with here. One of the cases that we've heard about just this week is an individual who used Wheel-Trans, for example. So they were in a wheelchair and they needed to be on a Wheel-Trans. But obviously, when you're on a Wheel-Trans transportation, you're not socially distanced from the other individual who are on the same bus. And some of those individuals have had COVID-19, are being transported with other individuals who don't have COVID-19. So that's a concern, and we're still navigating and trying to figure that out. So those are my top 5, and I'm going to pass it on now to Krishan with the Q&A. I think we have a little bit of time left.
Wow, thank you, Omar. So many important tips and useful information for all of us to consider. The chat is going wild here. There's so much that people want to know from you. So let's just dive in. The first one is from Camille. She is asking about whether or not it is legal for an employer to rescind a promotion offer and related compensation increase due to COVID-19. What's your take?
So I think it would very much depend on the circumstances and situations of that offer and what the details of that offer was. And if it was a firm offer, generally in employment law, there can be lawsuits for situations where an employer has rescinded it. But again, I think I'm going to go back to that principle that I mentioned before. There might be an argument for frustration. What I'm going to suggest, especially because our courts are in a challenging situation right now as well, and we're not going to see any instant resolution in terms of legal disputes, is that if there's a way for you to find another job in this interim period, that is probably your best bet, keeping in mind that if it does have, and this is more for executive positions, if it does have a very significant expense attached to it and you've relocated and incurred some of those moving expenses, then it might be a very different situation. And I would encourage you to reach out to a lawyer to get some additional guidance in that respect.
Great. Thank you, Omar. Another one from Elliot. This is a bit of a longer question, so it has a few parts to it. What is the actual exposure in Ontario for a small business that doesn't have a temporary layoff clause in their contracts, but lays someone off at this time? So for example, in Ontario, if your payroll is less than $2.5 million, you aren't required to pay severance. So is this exposure simply the 2 weeks termination pay?
Okay, so I'll take a step back here and being very cognizant of our time. Statutory severance is very different from payment in lieu. And so payment in lieu is what we typically call termination pay. So there are distinct concepts. For small employers, there is some unique exposure. What I would suggest in those types of situations, and this is an underlying theme, I think, of what I've been trying to get at in the past 25 minutes, is that as a society, we're in a unique situation. We should be having conversations and looking at the problems that we have within a legal framework, which is what we've tried to do here. But the solutions here are going to hopefully be common sense solutions. And so what I would encourage employers to do is to have an open conversation with their employees, explain to them what the situation is. And there might, in fact, be a way for them to say, we're going to agree to have a termination here and have that employee then tap into some of those emergency response benefits that are there that the government has announced. With an understanding that if the business picks up again, they're going to try to bring that employee back. It's going to be about the relationships. And I think in the same way that we're seeing many people in Ontario and across Canada picking up groceries for their neighbors, doing small chores and looking out for one another, I'm hoping that we can also see that within the employment context and within the workplace and other legal relationships that we see in society.
Great, thanks, Omar. We're going to turn the line of questioning to around rental and mortgage. So here's one from Judy. If someone has tested positive for COVID-19 in a condo or apartment, is that person legally required to notify the condo or superintendent of your status?
It would depend on the condo bylaws. So I think that's the number one thing to keep in mind. Generally, though, there isn't a duty to report in that respect. The relative risk of transmitting COVID-19 if you are in your unit and you do not leave your unit is very, very, very low, okay? And so I understand the concern, especially for those of us who live in downtown Toronto or in an apartment building somewhere else where there's a lot of people in very close proximity. Those are typically the situations where we're going to see greater rates of transmission. So what I would say is, if that's you or if it's your neighbor, try to take the appropriate precautions, you know, using a mask and gloves and things like that, even when you're throwing out the garbage, let's say in the condo. But no, I wouldn't say that there's a type of duty to report of that respect in the condo or housing context.
Great, thank you. This one's from Cheryl. If you can't afford your mortgage, what are your legal rights?
So this is a huge issue, right? And I think that the Canadian government is keeping an eye on it. There are a number of financial packages that have already been rolled out. And if your mortgage is for your personal mortgage, what I'm going to expect is that the banks are going to have more financing available. The government is going to push for that. And if you are a commercial landlord, and so if that's where the question is coming from, you can't pay your mortgage because tenants are not paying. There are already some small business loans that are available, and we're expecting more financial packages to come out. So I think the last thing in the world that anybody wants to see is that everybody loses their home, because that just creates more problems. So what I would say is that's more of a financial issue. There's not as much of a right from a legal perspective. You're still stuck with the contract that you're stuck with. But I think if you approach the bank that you have the mortgage with, they will also be very much in the loop and in the know in terms of the financing that's available. One of the concerns that we have is how the interest on some of those emergency loans are being applied. So there are some concerns about those interest rates being a little bit too high or a little bit too steep. But I would encourage reaching out to the bank to have that conversation.
That's great. Here's another question from Jay. Are there any free services we can use to help review legal documents like separation letters or termination letters?
There are lots and lots of free resources. So I think we have some of those links, and Jennifer has some of that information. So I'm happy to share some of that information. If you are eligible for legal services at your community legal clinic, such as the one that I work at, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to provide some of those resources for free. But there's also a lot of resources that are available online, and my understanding is that we're going to circulate some of those resources as well. So there are resources out there. There are people in the legal community, such as myself, who are very fortunate to have roles where we do these types of things free of charge because we want to help the community that we're in, and that's our job.
Great. Listen, Omar, we are at time at almost 1:30 here. I want to thank you for all of your expert advice and legal wisdom. I'm sure this will come in handy as we navigate these waters over the next few weeks and months. Thank you, Omar, and thank you to all of you who participated in this webinar. It's fantastic, and clearly we have some great alumni with subject matter expertise that are willing to share openly with our community. So thank you again, Omar, for all that you do for Ryerson, for our community, and you are a great friend to us. So thank you again.